Welcome in, everyone. Glad you could join us for this deep dive.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a pretty intense one.
Yeah, definitely.
We're tackling academic freedom today,
Absolutely.
a topic that's, you know, well, it's always been important, but feels especially crucial right now,
Yeah, it's really at the forefront.
especially with everything going on in China and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And the sources you sent,
Yeah.
they're fantastic articles from the AAUP,
Mm-hmm.
reports from Human Rights Watch,
Mm-hmm.
stuff from the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education.
Yeah, those are all really solid sources.
Really credible stuff.
So it gives us a lot to dig into.
It does. It does. And I think what we're going to try to understand in this deep dive
Mm-hmm.
is, what are the challenges scholars are facing?
Huh.
How do these restrictions impact education, especially as a path to freedom?
Mm-hmm.
And what does all this mean for, future generations?
Right, those are the big questions.
Yeah, big questions. So one thing that really jumped out at me as I was going through these sources is how the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, under Xi Jinping, has really tightened its grip on universities and research.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the CCP has always had a degree of control, right?
Right.
But under Xi, it's definitely become more overt, more assertive. They're making it very clear what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah. And the consequences for crossing those lines seem pretty severe.
Definitely.
When you read about cases like Professor Zhu Zonggrun being punished for criticizing Xi,
Right.
or the crackdown on Peking University's Marxism Society just for supporting worker rights, it's
Yeah.
chilling.
It is, and those are just a couple of examples. The sources paint a picture of an environment where surveillance is everywhere. Classrooms are monitored with multiple cameras,
Wow.
and faculty are under pressure to present even potentially controversial changes like the removal of presidential term limits as positive
It's
developments.
like they're trying to control not only what's being said, but the entire narrative around it. And in that kind of environment, self-censorship becomes almost a survival instinct, right?
Right, you have to, it's like walking on eggshells every day.
Yeah.
You never know what might be interpreted the wrong way.
One professor in one of the sources said they feel like they walk on thin ice every day.
Exactly. That
Mhm.
really captures the feeling.
Yeah, you can really sense the fear and uncertainty.
And it's not just limited to China. The CCP's influence is reaching beyond its borders.
You're right. There's a survey of U.S.-based China scholars mentioned in one of the AAUP articles that found 70% of them feel pressure to self-censor their work just to maintain access to China for research.
It's incredible, really. The pressure is often subtle, not explicit threats, but the impact is very real.
It's like this invisible hand shaping the very questions scholars are willing to even ask.
Exactly. People avoid sensitive topics because they don't want to jeopardize funding or collaborations, or even their ability to travel to China for field work.
So in a way, the CCP is creating this global ecosystem of self-censorship, where even scholars outside China are internalizing these limitations.
Exactly, and that has huge implications. It's not just about individual researchers, it affects entire fields of study.
Yeah, whole areas of knowledge could be left unexplored because of this fear.
And that brings us to another really important point highlighted in the sources, the role of financial interests in potentially compromising academic freedom.
Right, the elephant in the room, money talks.
Right. The Chronicle piece really delves into this, how universities, even in the U.S., can be swayed by lucrative partnerships and funding opportunities with Chinese institutions.
Like that case with Jennifer Ruth at Portland State University.
Yes. She was pressured to withdraw an article critical of a Chinese program because the administrators were worried about jeopardizing contracts.
That's wild.
It really shows how financial incentives can create these conflicts of interest.
Even in institutions that supposedly value academic freedom above all else.
Right, and it highlights the subtle ways the CCP's influence can operate. Through educational and cultural exchanges, they can subtly discourage critical perspectives.
So it's not just overt pressure. It's this more insidious shaping of the narrative.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so difficult to combat.
It's like this constant undercurrent that's hard to pin down.
Absolutely. And speaking of things that are hard to pin down, we have to talk about Confucius Institutes.
Yes, those organizations that on the surface seem to be all about promoting Chinese language and culture.
Right, a benign cultural exchange. But organizations like Human Rights Watch and the AAUP have raised some serious concerns about their true purpose.
Yeah, there's a worry that they're acting as a subtle arm of the CCP, promoting a very specific version of Chinese culture.
And discouraging anything that challenges that narrative.
The AAUP report mentions that nearly half of the Confucius Institutes operating on U.S. campuses have contracts with confidentiality clauses in them.
What are they hiding? Right. It's very concerning.
Yeah, that lack of transparency is a huge red flag for me.
And the fact that they often operate with very limited oversight from the host institutions and their funding comes directly from the Chinese government.
It creates a perfect environment for self-censorship and a narrowing of acceptable discourse.
It's like they're operating in this gray zone, blurring the lines between cultural exchange and political influence.
It makes you wonder how much of what they're presenting is genuine and how much is carefully curated propaganda.
Exactly, and it's a question that deserves a lot more scrutiny.
And it's not just China, right? The sources also talk about how the situation in Hong Kong has gotten significantly worse since the implementation of the national security law in 2020.
Right, Hong Kong was once seen as this bastion of academic freedom.
Yeah, a beacon of hope in the region.
But now, the national security law, which was imposed by Beijing, has really changed everything.
It's created this climate of fear and uncertainty within academia.
Absolutely. It essentially criminalizes any dissent or criticism of the government.
So academics are constantly walking on eggshells, worried about saying or doing the wrong thing.
And we're seeing the consequences. Universities are being targeted. Authorities are dismantling memorials for the Tiananmen massacre.
It's like they're trying to erase history.
They're restricting democracy walls, those spaces for free expression, and they're silencing student unions. It's a very deliberate effort to suppress any form of dissent.
There's this quote from a historian named Rowena that really stuck with me. She said that some of her colleagues have resorted to writing fiction because we cannot write the truth on paper anymore.
It's heartbreaking, really. The very act of researching and writing has become so dangerous.
It really shows the chilling effect this law has had on academic freedom.
It's a huge setback for Hong Kong's intellectual vibrancy.
And it underscores the fragility of academic freedom, even in places that were once considered relatively open and tolerant.
Absolutely. The situation in Hong Kong serves as a stark warning to the rest of the world.
It's like a canary in the coal mine, showing us how quickly things can change and how important it is to defend these principles.
Exactly, because if we're not careful, the same thing could happen anywhere.
And this is where the discussion about the impact on the next generation becomes so crucial.
Right. How are these restrictions shaping their worldview?
Their educational experiences, their aspirations for the future.
Big questions.
Yeah. The sources paint a pretty bleak picture. Professors are scrubbing their syllabi of anything even remotely sensitive.
Students are avoiding politically charged research topics.
And scholars are withdrawing articles because of pressure from publishers.
It's this self-censorship driven by fear, these ambiguous red lines, and a culture of anonymous reporting.
It's become the invisible shackle that binds academic inquiry.
Exactly, and it raises a crucial question. How can education truly be a path to freedom in this kind of environment?
Right. How can students develop critical thinking skills, explore different perspectives, and challenge the status quo when they're constantly looking over their shoulders?
That's what we need to figure out.
Yeah, that's the challenge, and it's a challenge with huge implications for the future of Hong Kong, China, and really the entire global academic community.
It's a global issue for sure.
So that's something we'll have to delve deeper into in part 2 of our deep dive into this complex and concerning topic.
Looking forward to it. It's fascinating, isn't it? This idea of education as a path to freedom.
It really is. You know, when you think about it, it's not just about learning facts and figures.
No, not at all.
It's about developing those critical thinking skills, learning to question assumptions, being able to engage in open and honest dialogue.
Exactly. And that's what makes the situation in Hong Kong even more troubling.
Right, because those very principles seem to be under attack there.
Absolutely. And it's particularly concerning how these restrictions are affecting the next generation, the students.
They're growing up in an environment where the boundaries of what they're allowed to think about are constantly shrinking.
It's like certain ideas are becoming off limits.
The sources mention how professors are hesitant to even include certain topics in their syllabi.
Yeah, even classic works by philosophers like John Rawls and John Locke are considered too risky now.
Because they might be seen as challenging the status quo.
Exactly. And that sends a really powerful message to students.
Like, don't even go there.
Right. Yeah. And it can make them hesitant to voice their own opinions or explore anything outside of what's deemed acceptable.
It really undermines the whole idea of education as a path of freedom.
It does. And it has long-term consequences, not just for individual students, but for society as a whole.
Right, because if you have a generation that's been conditioned to avoid critical thinking and just accept information passively
They're not going to be equipped to deal with the complexities of the world.
or to contribute to its progress.
Exactly. And it goes beyond economic progress, too.
Right. It's about being able to participate in a democracy, to hold leaders accountable.
To shape their own societies.
But when you restrict education, when you control the flow of knowledge,
You create a society that's vulnerable to manipulation and authoritarian control.
so the stakes are really high here.
They are. And that's why what's happening in China and Hong Kong is so concerning.
It's a global issue.
It is a threat to open inquiry and intellectual freedom everywhere.
One thing that really struck me in the sources was how the erosion of academic freedom isn't just about what's being taught or researched.
Right.
It's about the very structure of academic institutions themselves.
Absolutely. The sources talk about how universities, especially in Hong Kong, are experiencing these significant leadership changes.
With people seen as pro-Beijing, replacing those with more independent views.
It's a deliberate strategy to control these institutions.
To make sure they align with the CCP's agenda.
And it has a ripple effect throughout the entire system.
Faculty hiring, promotions, research funding, curriculum development.
Everything becomes influenced by this need to toe the party line.
And that ultimately affects the quality of education students receive.
It creates an environment where critical thinking is stifled.
Where diverse perspectives are shut down. And students are essentially being fed a very specific version of reality.
It's intellectual stagnation.
And it could lead to societal decline.
Because a society that's afraid to question, to challenge, to innovate, that society is not going to thrive.
So the question becomes, what can we do about it? It feels like such a daunting challenge.
It is. But the sources do offer some hope.
They stress the importance of awareness.
Making sure people understand the severity of the problem.
And supporting organizations like Scholars at Risk and the AAUP.
They're doing incredible work to protect academic freedom.
And within universities, students, faculty, and alumni can all play a role.
By advocating for policies that prioritize academic freedom.
Even when it means pushing back against pressure from powerful donors or governments.
It's about holding these institutions accountable.
And on a governmental level, we need stronger policies and diplomatic efforts.
To protect academic freedom and hold those who violate it accountable.
But it goes beyond institutions.
Absolutely. Individuals can make a difference, too.
By speaking out against censorship, showing solidarity with scholars who are being persecuted.
And promoting open dialogue about these issues.
It's about recognizing that academic freedom is a fundamental human right.
And it's a right worth fighting for.
This deep dive has really driven that point home for me.
It's not something we can take for granted.
Academic freedom needs to be actively defended.
It's an ongoing struggle.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to shift our focus to the upcoming generation.
Okay, yeah.
How do we equip them to navigate this increasingly complex landscape, where the boundaries of acceptable thought are constantly shifting and the pressures to conform are growing stronger?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
As we wrap up this deep dive, I find myself thinking a lot about the next generation.
Yeah.
How do we prepare them for this world where the lines of what's acceptable to even think about are becoming so blurry? And the pressure to just conform is so strong.
It's a huge challenge. And, the sources we've looked at, they don't sugarcoat it.
No, not at all.
They show just how tough it is for young people, especially in places like China and Hong Kong.
Where academic freedom is really under attack.
Exactly. They're growing up in a world where you're almost expected to censor yourself.
And where questioning anything is kind of discouraged.
And finding different viewpoints is getting harder and harder.
It's like they're being given this roadmap, but it only has one route.
Yeah, and any attempt to deviate, you hit a wall.
A dead end.
And that's what's so insidious about this whole erosion of academic freedom. It's not always about outright bans,
Right.
It's more about creating this atmosphere where certain ideas just become unthinkable.
You don't even dare to go there.
Right, it feels too risky, and so you start censoring yourself without even realizing it.
It's like this invisible cage for your mind.
Yes. And the bars are made of fear and uncertainty.
And this lack of exposure to anything that challenges the dominant narrative.
Exactly. And that's why just giving young people more information isn't enough.
Right. It's not just about access to information.
It's about giving them the tools to think critically.
To really analyze what they're seeing and hearing.
To separate fact from fiction.
And to resist propaganda.
They need to be able to think for themselves.
So media literacy is a huge part of it, right?
Absolutely. And a healthy skepticism, especially of anything coming from those in power.
It's about empowering them to become those active seekers of knowledge, not just passive consumers.
Yes. To question, to challenge, to be curious.
One of the things that struck me in the sources was the mention of democracy walls in Hong Kong being restricted.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how important it is for young people to have spaces to express themselves,
Absolutely. Both physical spaces and online spaces.
when they can share their opinions, debate ideas, have
Right.
real dialogue.
It's so crucial for learning and growth.
Those spaces are where they can test out their ideas,
Refine their arguments, find their voices,
learn to engage with different perspectives.
and build bridges across those divides.
But when those spaces are shut down, when dissent is silenced,
it sends such a damaging message.
yeah, it's like saying your voice doesn't matter.
Stay quiet.
Conform.
And that can have a lasting impact.
It can make them hesitant to participate in a democracy.
To speak up for what they believe in.
So how do we cultivate those spaces, especially in places where freedom of expression is under threat?
It's tough, but not impossible. I think we need to start by supporting those educators who are brave enough to encourage critical thinking in their classrooms.
Even when they're facing pressure not to.
And we need to advocate for policies that protect academic freedom,
That make open inquiry a priority.
that value different perspectives.
And on a personal level, we can have conversations with young people about these issues,
Encourage them to question what they're told,
to think critically about the information they come across.
and to understand why open dialogue and diverse viewpoints are so important.
It's about making sure they're not just stuck in an echo chamber.
Exactly. They need to be exposed to a wide range of ideas.
So it's like being intentional about creating a diverse intellectual diet for them,
Yes. Give them a taste of everything so they can develop their own palates.
and encourage them to stay curious, to keep exploring, to look at the world with a critical eye.
That's how we equip them to navigate this complex world.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. You know, it's a bit unsettling,
Yeah.
but also, in a way, empowering.
I agree. It's a reminder that academic freedom isn't just some abstract concept,
It's the foundation of a free society.
where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
So it's something we have to fight for.
Absolutely. And that fight starts with awareness, with understanding the issues,
And taking action.
speaking out, supporting organizations like Scholars at Risk and the AAUP.
And most importantly, never taking our own freedom to think and speak for granted. So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive,
We hope it's given you a lot to think about.
and maybe even inspired you to take action.
Because the future of education and freedom depends on all of us.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where knowledge is truly a path to freedom for everyone.